Hey everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. Well, at some point, it had to happen. We have to talk about this one thing. Now, if you're just starting out in magic and you get yourself a couple of books and just going to flip through them, the chances of you bumping up against one of these two terms is going to be very high. And those terms are Hermeticism or Hermetic. It is time to talk about this elephant in the temple of magic. But I think I had to get some professionals in for this one. One of the greatest Discord servers that we have around in the magical community right now is called the Hermetica Agora server. And I am joined by two of the moderators of this Discord server. First of all, I would like to introduce another return guest to the show, the Reverend himself, Erik Arneson. Erik, how are you today?
Oh, I am stellar.
Fantastic. And I am also joined by another repeat guest, two repeat guests on the same show. I know. What are the chances? I am joined by the Candle Screamer himself, Sam Block, otherwise known as Polyphony. Sam, how are you?
Never a dull moment. And it's Kendall Yeller. Thank you very much.
Kendall Yeller, apologies.
Semantics. Pulling our bread or butter.
We're going to get very specific on this episode because I think with this one, the term Hermeticism and Hermetic gets put on pretty much everything. It's like that whole put a bird on it that Portlandia had. It's like if you put Hermetic on something, immediately it becomes magical. And I've been doing this for a little while. The more one digs into something like Hermeticism, the more one says, I don't know if this word means what they think it means. Thank goodness I have both of you gentlemen here. So to get started, let's have a little bit of history. What do we need to understand about the world, the times, and the area from which something like Hermeticism sprung up?
There was war.
There's war.
Okay, all right.
Well,
2021, war was beginning.
Yeah. There was a lot of war. So Hermeticism happened because, mainly we got what we have because of a lot of like cultural intermingling and a cultural melting pot that primarily like came out of Alexander the Great's invasion of Egypt and conquering of Egypt in the late 4th century BCE. He founded a city down there. He called it Alexandria. I think he made like 10 of them. He made 10 Alexandrias scattered all over the world. And this is the most famous, probably even today where we have even more Alexandrias. There's a lot of them now, and Alexander's been dead for like 2,000 something years. So he founded this city in, I think, 302 BCE. And then he skipped town and he went and conquered some more stuff. And then he died. And he actually didn't spend a significant amount of time in Alexandria, Egypt until after he died. But what he did there is he created this place where Greek culture, Middle Eastern cultures, and African cultures all sort of squished together, and they mixed their gods just like a friggin' Reese's peanut butter cup. And and out of it, we got some incredible stuff. We got Hermeticism, for instance, right. And all sorts of other cool things. Alexandria was an amazing place back then too. There was a Jewish temple there, that had as much significance, at least to the local Jews, as the one in Jerusalem did. The Gnostics had a big thing going on there. There were lots of cool pagan philosophers all intermingling, and there was lots of trade going through. And then, of course, there's the famous Library of Alexandria, which burned down like 100 different times, and so on and so forth. I think, Sam, you could probably flesh out the details a little bit on that. I kind of gloss over things a lot, and Sam likes the details, so we'll let him fill in the cracks.
It wasn't just war. And obviously that's what, has never really stopped anywhere in the world. But, when Alexander the Great did, invade Egypt, he didn't just set up a city and, just went on to India. He also, in effect, established the Ptolemaic dynasty. Up until that point, Egypt was largely ruled by Egyptians. But once Alexander the Great came in and conquered Egypt, he instituted, Macedonian / Greek / Hellenistic rulers, the Ptolemies, who basically ruled over Egypt just the Egyptians had, only now they weren't ruled by Egyptians anymore. But in order to get shall we say, buy-in from the locals, they also had to, in effect, not just maintain their own Hellenic identity, but also adapt themselves to the local Egyptian identity. So you had this, from the top down, this weird intermingling of both, Hellenistic and Egyptian influence at all levels of society. And because of that, you end up getting not just Hermeticism, but all sorts of new syncretic cults, like Hermanubis, a mixture of Hermes and Anubis.
Serapis.
Thank you, exactly.
Yeah,
Serapis.
he was a good one.
This mix of Zeus and Osiris, who took on this whole new form. You have all sorts of new syncretic gods or Greek gods identified with Egyptian gods, more than just translating the names from Greek into Egyptian. You had different kinds of economy. You had different kinds of magic springing up. And this only continued later on once the Romans came in and then reconquered Egypt, essentially getting rid of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but also maintained the overall Hellenistic culture there. And they brought in even further changes, including changes to the religious structure of the Egyptians, because they wanted to get rid of, at one point, all the temple oracle cults. They wanted to crack down on the local economy so they couldn't have their own money anymore. It was a constant series of changes. And it wasn't just in Egypt. It was across the entire Mediterranean. Not just Egypt, not just the Eastern Mediterranean, but the entire Old World, which is a constant series of changes. You have the development of, Hellenist Judaism, Philo, who had whole new takes on Judaism within a more Hellenistic context. You had whole different movements of, quote, pagan monotheism, the extent or reality which is still hotly debated, but there was a trend for religions to move in new and unexpected directions that hadn't been seen before. And this continued along with the popularity of the Mithraic cult, Manichaeism, Christianity. You have all these new cults spring up left, right, and center. And it also wasn't just centered in Egypt and Alexandria. Bear in mind that, the whole Nile was populated densely, and traditionally the Egyptian capital switched between different cities along the Nile, one in Upper Egypt, one in Lower Egypt. Thebes was as important as Heliopolis. So you had all sorts of influences constantly rubbing shoulders, constantly bumping into each other, constantly developing new things. Obviously, shall we say, small variations and evolutions and invariants are on our mind because of what's going on in the war right now. That was exactly the same thing that was happening all across the old world at the time. And one of the things that resulted from that was, in fact, Hermeticism.
One of the things that Alexander did to ingratiate himself to his new Egyptian subjects is he claimed to be the son of Zeus Ammon, which was another new syncretic god that was a combination of Zeus, the king of the Olympians, and then Ammon, who was the king of the local Egyptian pantheon.
Why is understanding both Egyptian and Greek culture /life /philosophy important right off the bat with something like Hermeticism?
So remind me, have you done an episode on the PGM yet?
I have, yeah.
Exactly. That's one of the perfect reasons why it's important to understand.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the Greek magical theory, the word Greek's right in the name.
Right.
But they were written in Egypt. They were done by Egyptians and by Greeks and by Hellenistic Egyptians, Greco-Egyptians. We see this flawless synthesis of Egyptian religious and magical practices mingled with Greek religion and magical practices. You would see rituals where you're invoking Apollo, Horus, and Michael in the same breath. You're mingling the one Zeus is Serapis in a consecration of a talisman under the powers of the sun. We're calling on very Egyptian god forms of the sun, where the sun takes on different animal representations throughout the 12 hours of a day. That's the magical, technical side of things. And we see similar things happen as well on the, quote, philosophical side of things as well. You have Egyptian priests who still want their congregations, their clientele, who are still interested in, the mysteries of divinity, but who aren't just Egyptian anymore. They come from different backgrounds. And so the Egyptian priests, in their, wisdom, and with their wisdom that was held in the temples, they adapted, they evolved, they incorporated new influences, and they were to maintain quite a bit of power and wisdom and mysteries in teaching more people. When we talk about Hellenistic Egypt, it really is Hellenistic and it really is Egypt. It is both at the same time. So in order to get an understanding of what we're seeing when we talk about Hermeticism, we need to understand that this isn't just Greek. This isn't just Egyptian. It's this new fusion between the two.
Awesome. Love that. When one starts to just dig even slightly into Hermeticism, one figure comes up. And before we introduce him, could one of you talk a little bit about what is Interpretatio Graeca and how does it apply to the main figure involved in Hermeticism?
I don't know. Sam's going to have to do that one.
Okay, so for easy way out for that one.
Maybe I know that one. I don't know. I that's not a term that I've come across recently, but
in modern terms, we might consider it religious imperialism.
You mean sort of like cheek. So Greece sort of came in and they were like, oh yeah, it was just sort of a connect the dots game.
Exactly. It's kind of like we see, like, leave your 777 kind of stuff. God A in one tradition is God B in another tradition.
Oh God, it's like the Golden Dawn imperializing and appropriating every single thing that they come across, and they're like, no, it's all tarot.
Okay, so to an extent that is the case. But also, when you think about it from their point of view, the ancients' point of view, it wasn't really so much imperialism as it was just, this is what they do. We do essentially the same underlying thing, just they do it their way with their names, we do it our way with our names. So it wasn't so much that the ancients' time would literally consider Hermes to be Thoth. It was just, Thoth was just the Egyptian name for Hermes. And Hermes, therefore, is the Greek name for Thoth. Like, it was both what we consider today to be, quote, imperialism in that sense, but it's also just, this is just what they do.
They weren't the only ones that did it. I mean, maybe Rome in the popular mind might be more famous for having done this because they did it to Greece. And then they did it, across everything that they conquered. And in fact, that's why we have the names of the week that we do, is because Rome came into Gaul and they were like, you've got this god Odin, he sounds like one of ours. and if you're being really generous, you can say that it wasn't a form of empire building as much as it was a form of like trying to understand the local culture and the local religions. And also this belief that like the gods were big and incomprehensible. And if somebody else has a different name for them and has experienced them in a different way, like, who are you to say?
I mean, even for the ancient Greeks, they were very much aware, even within Greece, even within an individual district or polis in Greek, how a single god could appear in a dozen different forms. That was, the purpose of the use of epithets. So you have Poseidon, for instance, in Athens, in the area around Athens, you have Poseidon Soter, you have, the Poseidon who saves people at sea. You have Poseidon the Horse Lord, because he also ruled over horses. You have Poseidon Earthshaker, who ruled over earthquakes. It's still all Poseidon, but you have individual aspects, Poseidon wearing different hats, as it were, who ruled over different things, who interact with people in different ways, who had different rituals and rites for each individual aspect of the god. Consider that on a much wider geographic and cultural level, and you have the same kind of notion. You have Hermes, and then you have Thoth, and then you have Mercurius, who I guess are all the same god, but also have their own individual rites, their own practices. You go to them for different things, and so forth.
So the main figure that one comes up against with Hermeticism is a chap by the name of Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes Trismegistus. Why do you think that having a central figure like Hermes Trismegistus is important for the development of Hermeticism?
Who else is going to write all this stuff?
Basically.
I mean, Sam wasn't alive then.
Oh my God.
You have people saying that this guy was just writing book upon book. I think Iamblichus said that he wrote something like 20,000 books or something like that. But why do you think Hermeticism needed to have one figure?
I don't think it needed to have.
No.
So there's a tradition where you have these houses of life in ancient Egypt, essentially temple libraries. And in these temple libraries, you have these books on medicine, on ritual, on magic, on astrology, on good governance. You have all these arts and sciences and practices and manuals and handbooks, which were just stored in these houses of life, these par'anch. And they were all attributed to Thoth, because Thoth is the god of writing. He is the god of knowledge. He is the god of science, for the Egyptians, which is one of the reasons why he's associated with Hermes for the Greeks. And so no matter who wrote these books, they were always in the end attributed to Thoth, because Thoth was the lord of all knowledge in that case. So if knowledge was correct or true in some sense, it was Thoth's knowledge. In addition to that, a scribe never wanted to, say, make a name for themselves. They always wanted to have their work respected and accepted, and an easy way to do so is simply to appeal to the authority and just say, oh yeah, Thoth gave me this knowledge, therefore Thoth wrote this book. Therefore, it's in the whole domain of Thoth's knowledge, and therefore you can trust it. A bit of sleight of hand, perhaps. It's kind of simplistic, but it is also a way to attribute and therefore dedicate one's works to the god. In that same vein, when these texts that we now call the Hermetic texts were written, the same kind of practice was followed. Because they are considered true knowledge, because they're considered useful knowledge to reach divinity, they were attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who is essentially the syncretic Hermes Thoth.
And another thing about the Hermetic texts is a lot of them are written in the form of dialogues, right? So Hermes symbolizes sort of the wise teacher passing along sort of this wisdom. In very few of the books does Hermes say that he's actually writing it. You know, so he's a character in the books, but he's not necessarily the author of the books. And it's sort of like, you know, when you read any of the old philosophical dialogues, you've always got like people, some of which you might be more famous than other characters, you know, sort of passing along wisdom. You know, Plato does the same thing. You know, you go further into the future and it happens over and over again. Even in magical texts, we've got like the Isagoge, and we've got, you know, the Song of Circe and all that kind of stuff. You know, the dialogue is a popular form. And maybe, I mean, it could be that somebody was just sort of like, oh, I love dialogues where Hermes is teaching stuff. I'm just going to collect Hermes dialogues.
Yeah, he's the hero of his own story in a way.
Oh, yeah.
Hermes Trismegistus, why do you think even to this day, what makes him so special? The name itself has something to it as well, right? Can somebody elucidate on how Hermes Trismegistus got his name?
Hermes comes from the Greek god, probably. And then Trismegistus is Greek for 3 times great, you know, great, which apparently in Egypt was sort of the way to say the best. So he's basically like Hermes the best. A very modest name, if you think about it.
I mean, it's very similar to, you know, the title of, you know, Jupiter in Rome, you know, Jupiter Optimus Maximus. You know, literally Jupiter, the best, the greatest.
Right.
You know, very similar kind of, you know, naming conventions. You know, Egyptians had such honor for Thoth, they called him, you know, Thoth the greatest. So, and the way you say that in Egyptian was by to repeat the adjective to make it a superlative. That was basically it. And then, of course, as time went on and people kind of forgot this etymological origin, they gave folk etymologies to thrice-greatest. Like, oh, well, he's thrice-greatest because he's a great priest and king and, you know, magician, or he's great in the 3 hermetic sciences of astrology, alchemy, and theurgy, which is very beautiful, symbolic way to describe it, but it's fundamentally a folk etymology.
So let's get to the big question here, because people do talk about this. And you guys had some interesting responses when I tabled this question beforehand. But what is, in quotes, the Hermetica?
It is a title of 4 very modern books.
Okay.
Only 4.
One by Brian Copenhaver, one by Walter Scott, one by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, and one by, what was the other one? Someone else used the term Hermetica. Suffice it to say, of course, more recently, we use the term Hermetica to refer to the collection and overall corpora of classic Hermetic texts, you know, the texts that were ascribed or written by or attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in the early Roman Empire, from roughly 100 CE to 400-ish CE. So when we say the Hermetica, that's what people generally refer to. Of course, it's confusing to refer to the Hermetica because it's not just one single body of text. You know, you have the Corpus Hermeticum, you have the Perfect Sermon, you have the definitions, you have the Stobaean Fragments, you have the Oxford Fragments, and this, that, and the other, all of which are considered Hermetica. You also have a whole variety of astrological and yatromathematical and medical and talismanic and magical texts, which can also quite reasonably be called Hermetica, because for one reason or another, they've been associated with Hermes Trismegistus. And then on top of that, modern authors who want a little bit extra publicity or a little edge in their publicity have also titled their books The Hermetica, because like, oh, people can recognize their name, therefore it'll be easier to buy it, which works for varying degrees. It's a really confusing term in the end, but we talk about the Hermetica, no modern author specified, you're referring to the large collection of miscellaneous philosophical, theoretical, technical, practical, magical texts, which are associated with or attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in one way or another.
Plus the Emerald Tablet.
Oh, geez.
Sure,
We'll get to that. We'll get to
fine.
this. We'll get to this. So it has been said, and it is generally agreed upon. I don't know if you guys agree, but I hope you would, that the true heart of Hermeticism is one of these books that we talked about in the Hermetica, the Corpus Hermeticum. Before diving into the content of this book, what is fundamentally crucial to understand about the Corpus Hermeticum before we even read one single word of it?
It doesn't always agree with itself. It's short and it disagrees with itself. You know, people, I think, go into the Corpus Hermeticum, find a piece that they really love, and sort of then interpret the rest of it through this one little lens. But it's important to remember that probably every tract in the Corpus Hermeticum, of which there are 17, maybe 18, I can't remember.
17, 15th is a lie.
Because 15 is a lie, yes. You know, there are 17 different tracts. Many of them have very different tones. And I think it's important to remember that when you're looking at these, while it's important to remember the context of the others, it's also important to remember that each of these was probably written by a different author using the name Hermes Trismegistus, and that they didn't necessarily agree with each other or even know each other.
Just like with the PGM, you know, the PGM is not a single text. It is a collection of texts. Just so, the Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of texts. Each, just as Erik said, written by different authors, different times. And so each teacher brought their own perspective to the table, kind of like a panel of university professors all in the same department. They all kind of know the same thing. They all kind of teach the same thing. But that doesn't mean they're all going to agree with each other on all specific points of their discipline.
I like that comparison. Here's my metaphor that I like to use for talking to people about the Corpus Hermeticum, and to see if you guys agree with this. You know how everybody's grandmother is kind of the same? That everybody, you know, like they can be from various different cultures, but everybody's grandmother kind of follows a similar way of behaving, but they have these differences which are idiosyncratic. I think of each book within the Corpus Hermeticum almost like a grandmother unto itself. You know, they seem to be somewhat alike. They disagree with certain things, but they're still grandmothers. Would you guys agree with this in some way?
I gotta say, I'm super fond of those grandmothers that like trance out and talk to God and float in bodies of energy and stuff. Those ones are the cool grandmothers.
Or the ones that, you know, drink all day from sundown, you know, make awesome fried chicken.
Or that super grouchy grandmother who just rails on about how the world is evil and matter is a pit of filth and we should all be avoiding it.
Or the one who judges your dating, you know, choices and then, you know, basically may as well have a Twitter of her own for all the sharp humor she has.
Ah, yes, the grandmother of book 13.
Oh my God.
All right. so
how did we get to this point?
I just had to throw. Everybody's got an opinion about grandmothers. They really, really do, which is great because everybody's got an opinion about the Corpus Hermeticum once they read it. So 2 words, one which gets thrown around a ton these days, are Gnosis and Noose. What are these, and how should one think about them?
These are Greek words. And because they're Greek words, we can translate them fairly bluntly into English as gnosis being knowledge and nous being mind. But it's important to remember that these are technical terms in the context of Hermeticism, in the context of the Hermetic text. These have specific technical meanings that shouldn't just be interpreted as, oh, gnosis is just things you know. That's not how it works. Nous isn't just the thing that thinks inside your skull. It's a little more nuanced than that. A lot more nuanced than that. When we talk of gnosis, think of the gnosis of the Gnostics. In many ways, Hermeticism can be considered a kind of pagan Gnosticism. It's a little bit earlier than Gnosticism. You know, it definitely didn't go along the same world-hating or world dualist or world pessimist route as Gnosticism, or rather as many schools of Gnosticism tended to go. But part of the whole goal of Hermeticism is to achieve gnosis. And gnosis isn't just knowledge, but it's true knowledge, real knowledge. And I think it was Wouter Hanegraaff who described the different, quote, states of knowing that are present in Hermetic texts. And the way he described gnosis, which I really appreciate, is that it is non-discursive revelatory knowledge. It is an experience. It is not just something you pick up from a book. It is not just something you kind of deduce on your own. It is, honest to God, a divine revelation of true reality, of divinity. And part of the whole process and goal and way of Hermes that's taught in the Hermetic text is to reach Gnosis and to attain Gnosis. And not just once, but repeatedly, up to the point where, even if possible, to abide in Gnosis, which may be all but impossible while we're living in the body, but to reach that kind of state as much as we can. Because by that kind of altered state of knowing, of divine, revelatory, non-discursive knowledge, we come to know God. And by coming to know God, we come to know ourselves and the whole cosmos. And that's kind of the whole goal. And all of this is facilitated by nous, mind, which again isn't just the thing that thinks inside your brain, but it's a sort of divine awareness. It's the ability to perceive that which is real and true. It's the ability to receive that kind of gnosis, that revealed knowledge, and working towards even having nous, towards, exercising that faculty of divine awareness. That's the preliminary step you have to go through in order to achieve gnosis. That's kind of like my high-level depiction.
No,
What do you say?
It's perfect.
I think that was beautiful, Sam. I don't have anything to add to that. That was poetry.
That's a shame.
I think it's when trying to understand gnosis and its meaning as knowledge or learning or whatever, it's important to remember that, like, Greeks had in Koine Greek, which is the language that the Corpus Hermeticum was mostly written in, there was more than one form of knowing, right? Like, there was knowing through observation, knowing through experimentation, knowing through faith, knowing through, divine revelation. Like, these were all different things, different ways of knowing. They had different words for each of them and different ways of thinking about them. In English, we just have one word. We just have knowledge. It's too
boring.
It's a boring word, and it kind of like glosses over all of the differences and nuances between all of these different Koine terms.
I want to just tack something on here, because when I was starting out in magic all these years ago, there were a couple of books that just basically said something like, and then you enter gnosis and you can do the
chaos magic.
And it's just like,
or just enter gnosis state by jizzing all over a cracker or whatever they're doing nowadays.
But hey, I'm a huge fan of chaos magic. But I think people need to understand the gnosis that people are talking about in these books and they're writing about. That's not what they mean. Gnosis is an extraordinary experience. It is one of those things where it's just not you. I mean, maybe some people can. I haven't met any of them, but they can just go like, and I'm going to have a divine knowledge of a greater God. Like, that's one of those things you just don't turn on and off like a light switch. And a lot of the time, you don't have a choice in the matter.
Like, let's be honest. Hermes Trismegistus himself, in I think it's book 10, the Corpus Hermeticum, says, yeah, that's basically super difficult even for me, so I'm not gonna put people above his level on that. I'm not saying people can't. I'm sure there are definitely mystics and holy people out there who are just in constant communion with divinity to a point that's just unfathomably beautiful. You're not gonna find that kind of person on Reddit.
No.
You're not. Like, people have better things to do with their lives. Reddit's useful, but not for that. It's difficult. In order to reach that kind of state in the Hermetic sense, in this ancient, antique sense, it's rigorous, it's difficult, it is jarring. And just because you have it doesn't mean you're going to come out the other side okay. Like, think of the story of the 4 rabbis who entered the garden. 4 rabbis in the garden, and basically all but one of them got fucked up one way or another. One lost his mind. One died on the spot. One ended up committing heresy and ended up falling away from grace. Only Rabbi Akiva was the only one who was able to integrate that vision of the divine and then keep his head on his shoulders still. It's not just the experience of having gnosis, it's also the ability to integrate it after the fact. Because, we unfortunately see it all too common where people end up going off the deep end in this kind of spiritual work. And it's a shame, either because they don't know what they're doing ahead of time, or they don't have the support they need to balance things out. They don't know how to ground things out. They don't know how to integrate those experiences in a way that can be made sense of, in as much as they can be, make sense. It's dangerous and it's difficult. So for people to say, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to be with God now," like, are you going to take a face full of benzos? Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing?
None of your business.
I mean, we decriminalized most of that stuff in Oregon, so it's
there
hard
you
to
go.
tell.
So let's get to the nitty gritty here. What can each of you tell us about the more nuanced aspects of the Corpus Hermeticum? Like, is there a general gist to it? What does the cosmology look like within the Corpus Hermeticum itself?
Well, the cosmology of the Corpus Hermeticum doesn't differ a whole lot from the cosmology of the whole classical world. It's got the planetary spheres going on out to the eighth sphere, which is where all the fixed stars are. Beyond the eighth sphere, you have God or something that probably has a cool name. Again, it's one of those things. So, Corpus, the Hermetic philosophy or religion or whatever, it kind of fits into the pagan religious climate of Alexandria in that time. So it's got all the gods, it's got all of that stuff, and it has sort of its own additions. It's got like weird images in the sky that are associated with various torments and virtues, and it's got Hermes and his son Tat and their buddy Ammon and their other buddy Asclepius. And I guess when I read the Corpus Hermeticum, I kind of imagine it all happening over like a long weekend where they're all just sort of like hanging out in a cave, telling each other these stories and writing them down, and they just don't agree on everything all the time. But also, like, all of these people in the story are all sort of gods on their own. Tat might be Thoth. Ammon is the same as like the king of the gods, or Alexander the Great's other dad. And then Asclepius is the Greek god of sort of like medicine and healing, who was associated and sort of syncretized with Imhotep, who was the Egyptian architect who had been deified after his death, 2,000 years before, after he invented the pyramid, which is a cool trick.
That's Sakura, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, you must have some more interesting thoughts on that. I guess I hadn't really considered that the Hermetica would be in their own cosmology. I guess I've always just sort of looked at it as like a very standard sort of Ptolemaic crystal spheres with the fixed stars and some sort of like divine pleroma existing beyond it.
I mean, that's basically it.
Yeah.
Like, so again, bearing in mind the Corpus Hermeticum and the rest of the Hermetic text, which you mentioned earlier, why is the Corpus Hermeticum, as a brief tangent, just kind of backtrack a few steps. You mentioned earlier, why is the Corpus Hermeticum the true heart of Hermeticism? I would say that it's not. I would say it's one of the chambers of the heart of Hermeticism. I consider on equal footing with the Asclepius and with the Stobaean Fragments and with the definitions. I think they all work together to form the heart of Hermeticism. We can talk about this, later on, how the Corpus Hermeticum got to be so famous and important, but it's just one of several equally important texts to my mind. And bearing that in mind and knowing how often they agree more often they don't, but they also do differ on some points, I think it's easier to take a high level view that is high enough to incorporate all doctrines of the Hermetica. And when we do that, as far as cosmology is concerned, it really isn't that difficult. Like, Erik basically nailed it. Like, you have the Earth, center of the cosmos. You have the 7 crystalline spheres of planets around that. You have the sphere of the fixed stars around that. You have the starless heaven, the 9th sphere beyond that. And beyond that, you have God. It's that simple and straightforward. It is nothing too complicated. You don't have the whole pleroma and kanoma and all the syzygies that came up in Gnosticism. You don't have all the fascinatingly intricate graphs of reality involving different kind of souls you see in Platonism, or especially Neoplatonism. You don't see that level of intricacy or detail or complexity in the Corpus Hermeticum or the other Hermetic texts. It's fairly straightforward. I'm not a fan of modern Hermetic Kabbalah. I don't really use that for my own models. But if you were to just take like the modern Western Hermetic Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life, and just kind of like looked at that, it's like, okay, that's it. Like, that's basically like the representation of the cosmology you see. Very simplistic in a lot of ways. Yeah. Just 10 spheres and call it a day. Of course, certain texts do get into much more nitty gritty. When we talk about the 23rd through 26th Stobaean Fragments, more popular known as the Kore Cosmo, or the Virgin of the World, it gets to this really intricate system of dividing the atmosphere into 60 different grades where different types of soul dwell in each grade. It talks about how the different segments of the earth that we live on are divided up by element, and so different people live there, where people in the north have great legs and people in the south have great hair, and people in the east have a fantastic fantastic arms for archery, and people in the Mediterranean, well, they're kind of like the waste of the world, so they have great asses to the point where they all love having butt sex together. I swear to God, this is the actual Kore Cosmo.
Hold on, I want to test a theory here. Doug, can you show us your legs?
You can't see it, but I am naked from the waist down.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Those legs of the north are just too great for pants.
Hey guys, it's summer. When we have such long winters here, we get buck wild when the sun comes out for more than 6 hours a day.
Oh my. But yeah, so the cosmology of the Corpus Hermeticum and other Hermetic texts, it's really not complicated. And I think keeping it simple was also one of the appeals for it, because it's not going to institute this really complicated model that fundamentally can't be proved except by experiencing it. And I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes Hermeticism from a philosophy. We often talk about, Hermetic philosophy. I think that's kind of a misnomer, really.
Yeah.
Platonism is a philosophy. Stoicism is a philosophy. Epicureanism is philosophy. What makes them a philosophy, though, is that they are systematic. They have a set of axioms, and they use a system of logic to systematically prove certain things or to create certain models that fit within their system. Hermeticism is not systematic. It is not consistent. The school of Platonism and the school of the Peripatetics, Aristotelianism, they are systematic, and they weed out inconsistencies left and right like nothing else. Right. And you have huge, massive debates over conflicts and contradictions that arise. But Hermeticism, you don't see that. We don't have that. You have differences, and we just kind of roll with it. It's more of a system of mysticism, or to use the word in a very etymologically accurate way, not in the modern sense. It is not a system of philosophy, but of theosophy. Not so much of systematic wisdom, but of knowledge of divinity. It's much more fluid in that. Yeah. And so I think turning to Hermeticism to find hard set in stone models or systematic ways to encounter things, you're not going to find that, because it was never meant to do that.
I think that's why a lot of people get somewhat turned off when they finally work their way to something like the Corpus Hermeticum. It's not laid out in stone. It's not a guidebook. It's dudes talking, different dudes talking.
The Bible is more consistent than the Corpus Hermeticum, let's be honest. And that's saying something.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem for us. No. It's not a problem.
One piece of Hermetica, if we're going to use that term, that people confuse with the actual Corpus Hermeticum itself is the Asclepius, or the Perfect Discourse, because it's got the good shit in it. Why is this?
It does have the good shit in it. Oh man, it's got the magic statues. It's got the prophecies. It's got some cool prayers. It's got dinner.
It's got hell.
It's got hell. So the Asclepius, one of the reasons it was so important, just especially for us Western world folks, for 1500 years, it was, well, maybe not 15, but somewhere around 1500 years.
1,000.
Yeah. The Asclepius and the Emerald Tablet were pretty much the only pieces of Hermetica that were available to the Latin world.
Right. Do you think it as important as, I guess the way that you put it, Sam, is that they're chambers of our heart, but what are the major differences, say, between something like the Asclepius to the Corpus Hermeticum?
One is how it's been composed. I say composed purposely because the Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of separate texts. The Asclepius is written as if it were a single text. It provides a sort of narrative that we don't see in other texts. In other texts like Corpus Hermeticum, it's okay, here's dialogue. Hermes is talking to Tat, or Hermes is writing a letter to Asclepius. Simple, straightforward. But in the Asclepius, you have this narrative. You have Hermes and his students in a temple, and they, wait for the presence of the divine to descend upon them, that they get in their divine discourse. At which point Hermes talks and talks and talks and talks and talks, interferes with a few questions by Asclepius, and in the end they all go outside and pray to God. And
eat dinner.
and eat dinner. A dinner with no blood in it. Vegetarianism apparently is the way to go. Which for Egyptian priesthood, for Egyptian magic practices, that totally falls in line.
Right.
But the thing is that when you take a close look at the Asclepius, you see it's been stitched together from lots of different texts, just like the Corpus Hermeticum was, except they've been stitched together in a narrative format. Like every time Asclepius brings up a new question, it's kind of introducing a new topic, a new discourse. And because of that, you see also inconsistencies, only this time it's within the same, quote, text. It does discuss the ensoulment of statues with the divine. It does discuss, unlike other Hermetic texts, a final punishment for wicked souls that you don't see in other Hermetic texts. It does discuss a prophecy of Hermes Trismegistus regarding the end of Egypt and the end of the world, which has captured the imagination of many people over the centuries. But there are the usual doctrinal differences and there are the usual doctrinal similarities. So, I mean, it still falls in line for the most part what Hermes teaches or, is attributed to have taught in other texts. Like, that's fine. And that's why I think it's, another one of the valves of the heart of Hermeticism. It's just another collection of Hermetic texts. The issue with reading Asclepius, or the Perfect Sermon, however, is that with the Corpus Hermeticum, they were written in Greek. And they only were translated into Latin, when Marsilio Ficino got hold of them in the 15th century. And that's when they started, spread across the Western world, Western Europe. But even though the Perfect Sermon was originally written in Greek, we don't know what it says because we've lost the original Greek. It only survives to us in Latin and parts of it in Coptic with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. So we end up having to go one extra step to understand not just what the Latin is saying, but we have to figure out what the Latin was trying to translate on top of that. Because it's clear that the translator didn't use some of the words as regularly as we would have liked. And I think that's evident if you read modern translations, like especially by like Copenhagen or Salomon. It has a different tone, a different vibe to it, a different feel than you might find in the Corpus Hermeticum or Stobaean Fragments, because you're translating from Latin at that point, which itself was translated from Greek, as opposed to translating from Greek directly.
Let me float this, guys. Do you think that reading Asclepius before the Corpus Hermeticum would be beneficial?
6 of one, half dozen the other.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It hits differently, though. I mean, that prophecy stuff is amazing. Like having a land full of corpses and
rivers of blood.
Rivers of blood, like that. It's pretty metal, and it might hook some people that are really interested in Hermeticism, but you can't actually just say that all of what you're going to read next is going to be along the same lines.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I guess, I didn't read the Asclepius until probably like 2 or 3 years after the Corpus Hermeticum, I would guess. I think it sort of depends on your purpose. When you're approaching the Hermetica, like, what are you doing? Are you there to become a Hermeticist, or are you there to learn about something and, keep it on your bookshelf?
Right.
I feel like there's definitely some stuff in the Asclepius that doesn't get reflected well in other Hermetica, but also, who are we to say? Who are we to say which is more correct?
You mentioned earlier your view of like all the discourse, everything in the Corpus Hermeticum, like to take place in a camping trip over a long weekend.
And the Asclepius,
I do like that.
Yeah, but the Asclepius is definitely a camping trip over a long weekend. That's how it's presented. I know it's stitched together later and all that kind of stuff, but it's totally just all of them sitting down and having this long, super weird conversation, and then they're like, okay, we're done, time for dinner.
I like the camping trip. I also consider because of all the differences going on, rather than consider like Hermes and his students like camping out over a weekend, I consider rather like a bunch of Hermetic teachers who all study under Hermes shouting at each other in a debate hall. Because again, yes, they're all taught by the same thing. They all have the same underlying knowledge, the same experience that kind of link all together, but they all have different takeaways, and therefore that would account for the differences in doctrine and opinion. And so they're all shouting at each other, and then you have the students in the background going, I like his argument more, I'm going to go on his side, or like I think this one makes more sense to me, I'm going to go sit up by him. I think that's how I kind of reckon it. Just the Asclepius, because it's more historically known than the Corpus Hermeticum, at least for a longer historical period in Western Europe. It got a lot more fame and also infamy. Augustine cited it in City of Gods, but specifically only about the whole like installment of statues part. He didn't say anything else but any other part of the doctrine. He just kind of railed about it because like, oh, look at these pagans doing pagan-y thing. How awful of them. Like that, really, dude? Like, so
I mean, it's basically just Transformers.
Basically. So I would recommend at least reading book 1 and book 3 of the Corpus Hermeticum first. The rest of that, up to you. Book 1 and book 3 of Corpus Hermeticum kind of give you the founding myths of Hermeticism.
Right.
And the evidence from the way the text was written and how they've been preserved and how they phrase things suggests that they were indeed the first text written that can be considered Hermetic, if not proto-Hermetic. Because I'll note that those two texts never mention the name Hermes. We don't know who the narrator is them. We don't know who the author is them. We just assume to be Hermes because it does tie in rather well with everything else that Hermes is said to have taught. Even if they can't be considered Hermetic, I'd still want to say they're proto-Hermetic. And
Right.
because they give like the founding worldview, the founding cosmology, the founding impetus for why we would want to do any of this, I would recommend reading at least those two books, book 1 and book 3 from the Corpus Hermeticum, before reading anything else from the Corpus Hermeticum, the Asclepius, any of the fragments, whatever. That would be my recommendation.
Cool. That's very good advice. I want to switch gears here. Although found at a much later time, and the story of this is actually quite incredible, and people should look it up, and I'll have a link in the show notes to at least the Wikipedia page, but they're called the Nag Hammadi Codices. What is notable about these codices, and particularly the Hermetic texts within them, something like the Discourse on the 8th and the 9th, within these extraordinary documents?
The Discourse on the 8th of whatever the heck you guys call it. I always refer to it as the Ogdoad reveals the Ennead.
Right.
I just say D89, just for short.
D89, that's pretty good too. It's an initiation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have some hints of initiation in the Corpus Hermeticum, right? Like book 1 could be some sort of initiatic vision that the main character is being led on, and you assume it's the main character is Hermes Trismegistus. You have something akin to an initiation in book 13 when Hermes comes back and speaks to Tat, and he's like, I am now a being of pure energy. Listen to my words and you will be zapped into the next world. But then in D89, like it's vowel chanting and it's crazy stuff, and it's like Tat undergoing the initiatory process and howling as it changes him or something like that. It's, Nag Hammadi itself was such an incredible find. Like those changed our understanding of late antiquity incredibly, and it elucidated so much about the history of early Christianity and all that kind of stuff. But it also sort of tied together Hermeticism and Gnosticism and showed that like some of the stuff was shared between the two groups possibly, or they were at least reading each other's pamphlets. I think there's 2 or maybe 3 different Hermetic texts in there. There's the D89, the Ogdoad reveals the Ennead, and then there's the last chunk of the Asclepius. Is there another one, Sam? I can't
Thanksgiving
remember.
prayer.
Thanksgiving prayer.
Thanksgiving prayer, yeah. And they're in a different language. Like we've got the Asclepius that's in Coptic, and I can't remember, is the D89, is that in Coptic, or was
it's all in Coptic? It's
all in Coptic. That's
all
pretty cool. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of probably the thing that is most amazingly significant about it is its original manuscripts of this stuff shows us that it was actually happening, that there might have been some crossover with Gnostic Christians, and that is apparently considered important enough to be buried in a jar in the middle of the desert for some reason.
And what's nutty to me, and please look this up, people, if this is interesting, is that they found these and we only have some of them because the person who brought it back, he brought it to his house and his mother used them for a fire. He used parts of these documents for a fire. It's just like that's I consider that literally the last burning of Alexandria. I don't know if you guys would agree, but like that's the last fire of Alexandria right there.
It's definitely, it's a pain. I mean, the thing is, that was not done out of hostility though. It was just sort of like, oh, we need to start a fire and nobody brought home the newspaper today. But there's also, you should probably have your readers look up what happened to all the mummies.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
What didn't happen to the mummies? They ate them as confections. They made paint out of them. They had mummy unwrapping parties. Like, Jesus.
Oh, they used to use them in trains. They were powering trains. They were.
Oh my God.
Mummies.
All on Eric's part, other reasons why the Nag Hammadi findings were so important, at least for the study of Hermeticism. One of which is, it preserves sections 21 through 29 of the Asclepius in Coptic, which doesn't sound all that exciting. But when you actually look at what the Coptic says, it doesn't cleanly match up with what the Latin Asclepius says. So it shows that the underlying Greek, which we do know there existed a Greek version of the Perfect Sermon, ended up diverging as it got transmitted across different cultures, different countries, and in different languages. So we can kind of use the Coptic Perfect Sermon to cross-check what the Latin says. Like, that's interesting of its own. 2, the Thanksgiving prayer is also present in the Latin Asclepius, and it's given here separately from the Coptic Asclepius. And we can also use that to compare against the same Thanksgiving prayer that we find in PGM 3, because that's also there in Greek, which indicates that this prayer was surprisingly well known, at least to some extent, across Egypt and the Near East in this time period, and was used for different purposes. In the Latin Asclepius, it appears as a thanksgiving for the discourse. In the Nag Hammadi text, it appears as thanksgiving after the initiation of Tat from Discourse in the 8th and 9th. And the PGM, it appears part of a relationship-forming ritual with the sun. So in all cases, kind of the same overall purpose, but it's used in subtly different ways that all kind of tie into the same goal. And that's also really fascinating. And again, because we have it in Coptic and Latin and Greek, we can also compare the difference between them as well and kind of get a better understanding of what the prayer is actually saying. But Discourse 8th and 9th was a literal game changer for the studies of Hermeticism. Because up until this point in the mid-1900s, there was sort of fixed separation between the so-called philosophical Hermetica and the technical Hermetica. The Corpus Hermeticum is considered, quote, philosophical Hermetica, because it's all about cosmology and philosophy and theology, ethics and morality, that kind of stuff. But nothing magical, nothing mystical, nothing woo. And then you have like the Centiloquium of Hermes, you have magical texts, you have the Sacred Book of Hermes to Asclepius that talks about making talismans for each of the decans, you have the Atra Mathematica, you have all sorts of magical texts, divinatory manuals, ritual procedure documents, which are called the technical Hermetica. And for a long time, scholars like to separate the two out. Either something was philosophical or something was technical, and because of bias against wanting to seem too crazy, no scholar or academic really touched the technical stuff. It was like, that's for crazy people. We don't do that here.
Right.
But when they discovered Discourse 8th and 9th, they realized that you can't make that distinction because this builds very cleanly off both Book 1 and Book 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It involves the same characters, the same setting, the same purposes, in the same cosmology, in the same framework, using the same magical techniques we see basically throughout the PGM. Vowel chanting, barbarous words, names, rituals of spiritual elevation and divine ascent, like you might find in the Mithras liturgy or in the Book of Moses from PGM 13. You can't make that distinction anymore. The two actually are integrated. The technical serves the philosophical and the philosophical serves the technical. Because of that fundamental change, we now know that ritual was a part of the study of Hermeticism in the classical day. We know that initiation and divine ascent were in fact parts and not simply stuff that Iamblichus had made up under the name of Abaddon for his De Mysteriis. Like, these are things that were done, that some academics, including Festourier, who worked on the Greek compilation, the Boudet edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, said, oh yeah, that wasn't a thing. My theories won't be disproved by a, quote, little jar from Egypt. Well, it turns out he was wrong.
If I had $1 for every time somebody told me that.
The Discourse on the 8th and the 9th is a powerful stuff. Like, I would suggest, even if you don't know what you're doing, just reading it out loud or even ham-fisting your way through it, there's some powerful mojo in there.
Yeah, it's a good one. I didn't really know what I was doing or what I was looking at when I first got the Nag Hammadi translation. And I remember sort of reading that one and just being like, I don't know, I have no idea what's going on. What's with all the vowels?
And then you got a copy of Betts' PGM. It's like, oh, okay.
There's
I
more.
did, because I think I kind of ignored D89 for a long time until I started working with the PGM. And then I went back to it and I was like, this makes so much more sense now.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And it also looks really super similar to like the Books of Yo and other Coptic rituals that we also see throughout the Nag Hammadi collection and other Gnostic collections that are also written in Coptic. Like the Books of Yo is like just this constant stream of rituals of like anointing on heads and, you know, speaking of barbarous words and vowel chants and everything that basically is a much more Gnostic and much more involved and Baroque form, the same thing that D89 is doing.
Right. What is the Stobaean Hermetica, and does it add anything crucial to our understandings of Hermeticism?
Now we can just skip this part.
Damn.
The book is pretty expensive. I am going to say this. If you find a copy of Hermetica 2 by M. David Litwa, it's very expensive.
I saved up my book budget for a couple months to get it. I have it right here.
Oh, wonderful. There you go.
Oh, you fancy.
Sam has actually studied these a lot more than I have. I haven't even finished reading Hermetica 2 yet, but
The Revenge of the Hermetica.
Yeah, I'll give a brief overview and then Sam can fill in all the details like usual. So Stobaeus was a Greek dude who was way into making sure that his son was very well educated. And he basically put together, I guess, sort of like a curriculum for him, or maybe like just one big book filled with all of this stuff. Like, oh, here are the things you're going to need to be a well-rounded, smart Mediterranean merchant, whatever he was going to be. And some of the stuff that he included in there are a lot of like sometimes extremely short fragments, but sometimes, you know, sizable paragraphs or a few pages, quotes out of texts by Hermes Trismegistus, or, you know, Hermetica, basically Hermetica. And almost all of the time, these are pieces of Hermetica where we don't actually have any other copy of it. We don't have the original papyrus or whatever that this was written on. We just have what Stobaeus wrote down for his son. It's sizable. It's, you know, there's a lot of them. We only have like a couple translations into English, one by G.R.S. Mead, I believe, which is, oh yeah, you should probably warn your readers. You should put this in big letters at the top of the show notes. If you're going to read any Hermetica, skip G.R.S. Mead. Like, just, if you don't want to spend money on the books, go read Everard. It's like reading Hermetic Shakespeare, but it's fun.
Fight.
He's better than Everard. Come on, give it that much.
Mead is not better than Everard, Sam. But yeah, so I mean, that's sort of like the overview of the Stobaean fragments. But Sam, you have been spending a lot more time with them than I have, and I know that you've been making that face.
Thoughts and opinions, as usual.
Yeah, you know, the thoughts and opinions face.
So to build on, you know, what Eric just said, whenever you have the chance, go for a modern translation. For the Corpus Hermeticum and Asclepius, go for Copenhagen or Salomon. For most of the other Hermetic stuff that we have available or extant to us, go for Litwa. It is worth it. Yes, you can use older translators like Mead or Everard or Chambers, which is even worse. But like, modern translators have more resource at their disposal. We have more contextual information. We have better understanding of the culture and religions and movements that were going on at the time of the writing. Modern translators know what they're doing because they have more information available to them than what Mead had in his time, or what Walter Scott had in his time, or so forth. Walter Scott isn't even really a translation of the Hermetica, let's be honest. Like, he just did his own thing. Great insights, but
as he does.
Copenhagen said it best. At times, Scott is brilliantly right, other times brilliantly wrong, which, ooh, backhandedness, that hurts me. But yeah, you know, basically, you know, Eric got it right. You know, what the Stobaean fragments are. These are selections and excerpts from Hermetic texts, many of which we don't have anymore. They existed at one time, they no longer exist. Maybe one day we will uncover another Nag Hammadi like cache. Maybe one day we'll find some moldering manuscript in some small dinky university in the middle of Greece, you know, that has copies of this, you know, these texts. But until that point, the Stobaean fragments from his anthology that he wrote for Sun is one of the most informative sets of Hermetic stuff we have. And it kind of takes a middle place between the philosophical Hermetica and technical Hermetica. It was still considered, quote, philosophical Hermetica, but it gets a lot more into cosmology. It gets a lot more into the nitty-gritty of the nature of the soul, or the nature of truth, the nature of how things come to be. It does involve moralizing aspects and ethicalizing aspects. It does talk about, the proper way to think or to judge truth. It does talk about that, but also talks a lot about astrology. It talks about, the role of the 36 decans and how they exert influence not just on the planets, but also on our world, and how energies transmitted from God on high down to us by means of the decans. It talks about how fate is affected in our world, this chain of providence and necessity and fate and the planets and justice, and how all these things tie together. Again, because these are collections for Hermetic texts, they're not always consistent. But John of Stobie was smart when he did this. He did pick out things that were, for the most part, consistent. The thing is that he also most likely meddled in the specific phrasing because he didn't want to give his son trash. He didn't want his son unintelligible garbage. So he may have edited the text slightly, but that doesn't decrease their value or their importance for us to read them. And they do receive a lot less attention, which I think is a damn shame, because they're fascinating to read. And I think they are at least as important as the Corpus Hermeticum or Asclepius, if at least on their same level, because they give us so much more material to work with and are so much more informative on some specific stuff. And you can clearly see how they build on or relate to stuff that's discussed in the Corpus Hermeticum or the Asclepius as well.
Nice.
If any publishers out there are listening to this, I agree with Sam that the Stobaean Fragments definitely need more attention. But if you're going to be pricing the books this high, they aren't going to get any.
And that's I hate that. I want more people to read the Stobaean Fragments, but I also understand that not everyone has $150 to drop on a single book.
It's not even well bound. I mean, it's kind of a crappy, cheap ass hardcover. I was so frustrated when I got the book. I was like, this is, it doesn't even smell good.
And that's how that's the worst.
Do you have scratch and sniff books or something like that? Is there? Oh, and you can't see it, listeners.
It's like bleach.
but Erik just sniffed his book.
I mean, we all know the new books. Like, there's new book smell, there's old book smell, and then there's wasting our time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dear.
I mean, at least it doesn't smell like vellum.
True.
600-year-old vellum is one of the worst smells. Oh,
I don't think I know that smell. Could you describe it for us?
It smells like, okay, imagine you could take the smell of a wet dog and you could store it in a box for a really, really long time with some moldy corks from corked wine.
Ooh.
And then you took a shoe, a leather boot in particular, and you wore it for a while, and then you poured that other smell into the leather boot, and then you sniffed that.
Maybe
some people,
from
across the room.
Some people really enjoy that smell. There's antiquarians that just probably really love that.
Yeah, the one who introduced me to the book, he was pretty excited about it. He's like, you gotta smell this. This is a vellum book. And I was like, this isn't.
I'm not gonna yuck their yum. We all have our kinks, but I don't think that's one of mine.
No, I don't think. I mean, you might have to give it a try.
Gentlemen, focus. All right. As there are quite a few, albeit smaller, Hermetic texts, are there some documents which are crucial to Hermeticism besides the ones previously mentioned? The Stobaean fragments talked about previously exist, but are there other fragments that exist as well?
Absolutely. So the Stobaean fragments, we call them fragments because they're just excerpts. You can also call them Stobaeic excerpts or just the Stobaea Hermetica. Either way, it's the same thing. But Litwa also translates the Oxford fragments, which are another set of, I think, 5 short Hermetic texts. Again, one on the soul, one how the soul's composed, one how things come to be. Fairly straightforward stuff. It helps us further understand more things. More recently discovered were the Vienna Hermetica, which are very bad condition. We can barely translate them. They're so lacunose and full of holes, but we can still get some further elucidation on how humans alone have reason compared to anything else that exists with life, or how God has no name and requires no name. Small, simple fragments, but they do exist. Those are just the texts that exist on their own. It's hard to say Stobaean Fragments exist on their own because they're part of a greater work that John of Stobie put together, but there's still excerpts that stand on their own. Then you have the dozens and dozens of patristic writers and philosophers and alchemists and magicians who have over the centuries included other aspects of Hermetic teaching and doctrine in their own work. Tertullian, Lactantius, Zosimus of Panoplus, Augustine, Cyril of Alexandria. You see reference to Hermetic doctrine that we can also pull stuff from throughout dozens of authors across the centuries. They are often embedded in the text, and they're usually not particularly long. Generally, if you see a discussion about Hermetic doctrine by a patristic writer, it's going to be a giant refutation of all heresies kind of thing regarding them. Okay. But they do exist, and they are also helpful in understanding more about Hermetic doctrine.
Flesh things out a little bit more?
They can, yeah. Basically, like rarely will they be particularly revelatory. Like,
right.
Book 1 of Corpus Hermeticum is revelatory, literally and figuratively for us.
Right.
But they still help in fleshing out not just what Hermes Trismegistus was teaching, or at least said to have taught, but how they were received and understood by people of his time and later times, which is also useful because in our conversation tonight, we've been talking a lot about, classical Hermeticism, but it's not like Hermeticism just went poof and just vanished, in the Roman Empire. It was still kept around, although it was often integrated or intentionally talked about negatively. It depends. But those doctrines still existed, and they were still discussed and received by different people for different ends.
To speak a bit more of those people, we have to understand it's not like Hermeticism just went away. People knew it existed and people talked about it. So what did singular figures such as Iamblichus or Michael Psellus and others, what did they add to Hermeticism?
Yeah, Iamblichus, it's been a long time since I've read Iamblichus, so I'm probably going to sound a little bit like an idiot when talking about him. He's sort of considered a Neoplatonist or maybe Middle Platonist. I can't remember. I think that I can never remember which one of those terms we use for Neoplatonist. And he does reference Hermes Trismegistus, I believe. I'm not sure how much he added to Hermeticism, but he definitely might have pulled ideas from Hermeticism to power Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is an incredible, rich, bizarre philosophical system filled with like emanations and theurgy and really cool stuff. I think that it meshes well with Hermeticism. I guess I definitely use Neoplatonic ideas to try to comprehend Hermeticism sometimes.
For my part, I don't think other figures so much added to Hermeticism, but they used Hermeticism to add to their other traditions.
Right.
Like Iamblichus, when writing under the name Abaman, in his reply to his Periphery, which is what we now know as On the Mysteries, he was trying to justify to Periphery why theurgy is good, why theurgy is legitimate. And he relies on, appeals to authority, to both Egyptians and the Babylonians, but also explained how these things augment and further philosophy in a way that rational discourse alone does not and cannot.
Can I just interrupt for a second here? For people that don't know theurgy, give me 2 sentences that sum up theurgy.
Yeah. Divine work.
Theurgy is it's a type of magic. It's a type of magic that is, I guess, very mystical in nature, where the goal is to ascend to the divine realms instead of like manipulate things in the material world, right? So like theurgy will help you step up through the crystal spheres and reach, so your soul can sort of ascend and hang out with the divine instead of being trapped on earth.
For my part, I also said theurgy is the art of bringing us humans up to the level of the gods and the gods onto our level as humans. So it encompasses both spiritual ascent and divine elevation, as well as the ensoulment of divine images to house the gods so we can more directly approach them, as well as even possession by the gods to inhabit our own bodies and perform works down here in this world. It is still a kind of magic, but it's often contrasted with thaumaturgy, wonderworking, right. What most people do when they talk about magic, love spells, money spells, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like the thing with the cracker.
But people often consider thaumaturgy, quote, low magic and theurgy high magic. I hate that distinction. It's not accurate because the same ritual can be done for either thaumaturgical ends or theurgic ends. Just the goal is different. It's a horizontal distinction rather than a vertical one.
Right. Something that you mentioned earlier in a document that you're going to produce, and when you do, I'll put it up in the show notes, but you talked about how Hermeticism preceded Neoplatonism or Neoplatonism, as I very often use it. I don't have a ton of respect for it, but that's just me, and we can fight about it later. So Iamblichus took bits of Hermeticism to kind of bolster his Neoplatonism, did he not?
Basically.
Yeah.
That's it, basically. So when the Hermetic texts were being written, Iamblichus wasn't on the scene yet. He wasn't even born yet for some of these things. He only arrived afterwards and then started taking some of these Hermetic, or to him, Egyptian, because the word Hermetic or Hermeticism didn't even exist back then. Like, they never considered what they were doing. In a different way. From our perspective as modern people, we can look back in time and see all these, quote, Hermetic texts be part of like a kind of continuous, loose tradition. But to the ancients, they would never have thought that way. They just thought what they were doing was just Egyptian.
Right.
It's just Egyptian. Like that's it. So it's Egyptian wisdom. It's Egyptian practices. And that's fine. Nowadays, we call it Hermetic after the fact. And when Iamblichus was writing his letter De Mysteriis, he kind of brought some ideas in. Neoplatonism occurred after the Hermetic texts were, for the most part, already written. What that does mean is that Hermeticism is not synonymous with Neoplatonism.
Right.
It is not reliant upon it. And you don't need Neoplatonism in a study of Hermeticism at all. That being said, there are definite Greek philosophical influences in Hermeticism, especially early and middle Platonism, as well as Stoicism, as well as to a much lesser extent Aristotelianism, the Peripatetic school. So there are definite Greek influences in Hermeticism. That's true. But Neoplatonism actually wasn't one of them. Rather, it was the other way around, where Hermeticism influenced Neoplatonism.
Two words that we've thrown around a little bit, I just maybe want to stick a pin in it, is what is technical Hermetica?
The magical shit.
That's all the fun. That's all the rituals, burning your incense and chanting at things and
stones, candles, herbs.
Yeah, carving rocks and yelling at candles.
Yeah.
It's astrology, alchemy, medicine, dye making, ink making, the actual process of incense making and the installment of statues or talismans. All that is considered technical Hermetica. It's the magical, practical side of things, as opposed to the more meditative, contemplative, philosophical, theosophical stuff.
So could we consider basically technical Hermetica, like the early intersections between Hermeticism and magic?
I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think it's more right to look at it as, magic was part of Hermetic practice.
Okay.
From the get-go, yeah.
Yeah. It was there all along. There was chanting and ecstatic trance and theurgy and petitioning the gods and all that kind of stuff was there from the very beginning. It's just part of what it was like to be a weird, smelly monk in Alexandria around that time.
Like, also remember, Egyptian culture and religion, like, magic was itself revered as a divinity. All the gods were seen to have magical power and to use magic. For them, while we today might see a difference between religious ritual and magical ritual, there was no such distinction for them. And even today, for a lot of traditional religions across the world, there really is no distinction. It's more like, is this something we like? Okay, it's proper religion. If it's something we don't like, okay, well, it's magic and witchcraft. Like, it's all still fundamentally magic. And for the Egyptians, there was really no distinction. So I wouldn't say that the technical Hermetica are an intersection between Hermeticism and magic. It's magic. And it was, quote, Hermetic from the get-go. Because again, remember, Hermeticism wasn't a thing. It was just Egyptian back then.
Right.
So Egyptian magic could also be said to become Hermetic magic within at least a Hellenistic context and framework.
Right. Their world was magic already. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so is ours.
It is.
Yeah.
In that same vein, what are the intersections between Hermeticism and astrology? I mean, it's vast. So can we get like a short summary between Hermeticism and astrology?
Yeah, I think, again, we have to go back to, when you asked about the cosmology of Hermeticism, astrology wasn't a thing that was separate from ordinary life, right? Like, it was just the way that they looked at the universe and the way they looked at the world. And now when you get into like technical Hermetica, there's some really cool stuff like Hermes Trismegistus writing on the 15 fixed stars and stuff like that. It was just the way things were. There was a connection between the fixed stars and the earth, and it was the duty of like, highly paid astrologers to pay attention to this stuff, to figure out like how the world was working and why it was doing what it was going to do, and when the king should go do certain things and when this and that would happen. I'm not sure that Hermeticism necessarily had a special connection with astrology as much as it did Hermes Trismegistus himself being seen as this like super wizard sage guy. His name was attached to texts and treatises on astrological magic. Now, interestingly enough, one of the very late Hermes Trismegistus quotes we have is in the Picatrix, which is a book on astrological magic, which is kind of cool. That's like 800 years from where we are discussing right at the moment. Yeah, I mean, would you say that's accurate, Sam?
Sam made a very interesting face.
Oh, you made the face I wasn't even looking.
I made a face. So bear in mind that, looking at the skies was a way you could tell time. And in some forms of ancient Egyptian religion, Egyptian priests had to do rituals around the clock. Because again, consider, the ancient Egyptian notion of when the sun dies, when it passes across the western horizon, it dies in the underworld. And in order to ensure the sun to rise again, as well as, praying for the spirits of the dead pharaohs who also crossed over, they had to do rituals at certain times of the night in order to make sure that, the sun and the pharaohs survived the torturous, perilous passage to the underworld so they could be reborn again in the east. And so because they had to understand star charts and star clocks, at certain times of year, certain stars were rising at certain points, they can use that to track the time. When you combine that with Babylonian and then Hellenistic astrology, within, the whole cosmology of the earth within 7 spheres of the planets, you get an extra layer of that. And even in Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum, it describes how each of the planets confers a certain energy of generation to individual humans. And as we rise through the spheres to divinity, we have to learn how to give up those energies so we're not held down by them. Then this is getting to a really heavy doctrinal part, but I'll try to make it high level. Hermeticism teaches essentially dualism when it comes to humanity. We are body and we are soul. Our soul comes directly from God, but our bodies are created by nature, and nature is under the rule of fate. And the government of fate is the government of the 7 planets. So our bodies are ruled by fate, but our souls are inherently not ruled by fate. But because the soul lives in the body, it can be impacted by fate. So if someone curses you, well, that's just your fate. But that curse will technically never actually affect your soul unless you let it. That's the distinction we have to learn here. That's even in Book 1. Book 3 actually says that it's one of the jobs of humanity to learn the sign-seeding acts of heaven and analysis of the circular motions of the stars. Like, it actually tells us there in Book 3 to study astrology. Like, that's what it's saying. And in the Stobaean Fragments, we can kind of expand on this notion. I mentioned earlier this chain of providence, necessity, and fate. Providence is the will of God. So what God wants to happen, that's providence. Necessity is the logical consequences and ramifications of the will of God. This allows the cosmos to essentially be consistent with itself. If I want to throw something in the air, that's my will. But because of gravity that allows that thing to exist to begin with, it also has to fall back down. Then there's fate, which actually arranges things in order to fulfill the obligations of necessity. And fate is itself affected by the 7 planets. So the study of astrology is quite literally the study of fate, by which you can learn the will of God, not just why things happen, but why things have happened to get us here to begin with. Because of that, I think astrology, it has the most claim to being like the Hermetic art.
Right.
Like, not just an art that's most associated with Hermeticism, but even the arts of Hermeticism, this is the first and foremost. Of course, I'm sure there'll be some people listening like, oh, what about alchemy? Well, alchemy also relates to astrology in a really interesting way. And this is going to tie into a couple things we're discussing in a bit as well, but we all have heard the statement, as above, so below. It's
never, not once. I've never heard that.
It's this notion of correspondence or sympathy between that which is on high and that which is below. And if you consider it, astrology and alchemy are two sides of the same coin. We look up for astrology to understand why things happen. And then we look down with alchemy to understand how things happen. Because what is alchemy? Alchemy is the study of change in the world by means of transmutation of the elements, how to make things out of it, sure, how to make talismans, oils, medicine, poisons, whatever. But it's also the study of how things change in the world. You look up to see why, you look down to see how. And when you combine the two, that's what allows a complete knowledge of all the things that are. So astrology is crucial for this.
Did you just explain the operation of the sun?
I don't know, did I?
I don't know.
Not like I paid attention to Emerald Tablet. no one understands Emerald Tablet. Like, let's be honest. Everyone's enamored of it, but no one understands it.
Yeah, that's true.
Beautiful. That was wonderful, Sam. Both of you, guys, this has been amazing. But
yeah, I want to say, like, I made fun of Sam making the face that time, but he was totally right. For some reason, when you asked about astrology, I was kind of just fixed on the stars, and I didn't even think about the rest of the stuff. But you also see this sort of like idea of escaping fate, or kind of like moving beyond it, in the initiatory text of Book 13. Hermes, I've mentioned this book already a couple times because it's sort of significant to me. Hermes comes back and he claims to be outside of his body and teaching Tat how to sort of like ascend through the spheres. And there's definitely a sense there of like addressing fate and learning how to kind of like escape the tormentors of the material world, of nature, and of having a body, and like ascend through stuff, which I think is very closely tied to kind of like the astrological vision of how the planets are tied into the those three elements of predestination that Sam mentioned. So I was wrong. I'm super happy to have me being wrong recorded once more on a podcast, and I'm going to add this to my collection.
It's okay. You're so pretty. We still love you.
Send your hate mail to me, people. Don't send it to Erik.
Oh no, please make them tweet at me.
Oh, please. Okay. No, send it to me. I need more excitement on Twitter.
I don't know about that, Sam. A word that one will come across a lot as well is Hermetism. So what is the difference between Hermetism and Hermeticism?
Ooh, you know what? Well, supposedly, I can't remember who wrote about this. Was it Fowden, I think, who maybe first proposed this? But Hermeticism went through sort of a renaissance in the Italian Renaissance, and through this rebirth, it became something new and delightful and different. Some scholars have sort of suggested calling everything before the Italian Renaissance, or maybe there's another dividing line for it, but anything sort of like in the late classical, late antiquity, that's Hermetism, classical Hermetism. And then when you talk about the new stuff, it's Hermeticism. I have tried to do this myself, but it feels so tedious and technical. I'm cool with the technical Hermetica, but I'm not cool with technical Hermetism, I suppose.
For the most part, I agree. And I wouldn't say it's just the Italian Renaissance. It's also the Arabic and Islamic Golden Age as well.
Right. So there's a different cutoff date, isn't there? Like, what do they usually use?
My cutoff date is like basically, say 700 or so CE. That's my personal cutoff date.
So then for you, the Emerald Tablet is too new.
The Emerald Tablet is basically on the threshold between the two.
Okay. Maybe the Emerald Tablet is the cutoff.
That's basically my cutoff, yeah.
Okay.
So I have two ways to understand the distinction between Hermetism and Hermeticism. One is the one that Erik basically already mentioned. Essentially, Hermetism is the classical stuff, and Hermeticism is the post-classical stuff, including the Arabic Renaissance, the Islamic Golden Age stuff, as well as the Italian Renaissance, the humanist stuff, as well as the German Renaissance, which focused less on the Corpus Hermeticum and more on the alchemical stuff that got from the Arabic and Islamic kind of Hermeticism. That kind of all came together. And all kind of came together with the Golden Dawn, again, kind of merging everything back together. Basically, everything from, say, 600, 700-ish on is Hermeticism. Everything before is Hermetism. And Hermetism, therefore, is the core, the, shall we say, fundamentalist side of things, the originist kind of thing.
Right.
That's one way to understand the terms. And in a blog I posted, blog post I had, where I basically pitched a fit. I got continually annoyed. People keep insisting on Kabbalion fucking Hermetic. I said, okay, you know what? Fine. Y'all can have the Hermeticism. I'm going back to being a Hermetist. Thank you. But
I don't think that's possible, though.
It's the thing. Like, it's hard. Like, it is hard because for a variety of reasons. I'm just used to saying Hermeticism. Like it's not easy to say, but it's just what I've been used to saying.
If people don't know, Sam's best writing is when he's angry and exasperated. It really,
especially during Mercury retrograde. Especially during Mercury retrograde.
When he's exasperated, it's like, oh man, this is toothsome, and I do the of the fingertips little. It's so good.
Splatter was everywhere.
Where he'll be like, I don't know what happened. I sat down and like 4,000 words.
That's
fell
it.
out of
It just fell out.
Whoops! Didn't know that was gonna happen. Here we are. That was one way to understand the distinction between Hermeticism and Hermetism. The other is a distinction I got from Christian Bull, who wrote this fantastic thesis on classical Hermeticism. I think it's really worth everyone to read. Religions in the Greco-Roman world, the tradition of Hermes Trismegistus, the Egyptian priestly figure. Great book. Anyone who's interested in Hermeticism/Hermetism should read it. It is a fantastic analysis and synthesis of so much material. And in that book, Christian Bull sets out the distinction that Hermeticism is the general field of Hermetic texts and all the things that have come from it, in general, classical and post-classical. Hermetism specifically is not just classical stuff, but it's the specific tradition of spiritual elevation and divine ascent through initiation in the way of Hermes. So if you want to consider Hermeticism to be the general field of a culture, Hermetism is the specific religious initiatory path that one would take. So it's a much more refined, specific definition that I do actually kind of like. It's like if you're, looking at book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum to get a notion of what the energies are of the planets and kind of do something around that, okay, well, today's Monday. I need to focus on this thing to kind of, meditate on. That's Hermeticism. If you're actually implementing Discourse 8th to 9th, and then reciting the prayer of Thanksgiving afterward, that's Hermetism. A very subtle distinction, but I do like it.
Ooh, that kind of makes me excited. Yeah. I like that one.
Christian's writing is fantastic. The stuff that I can get that's not put out by Brill.
Brill, the only thing that's more expensive than Hermetica 2.
Christian Bull's a godsend.
Yeah, no, it's really wonderful stuff. All right, gents, let's talk about the big one, unfortunately. The Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet. Why do people still go apeshit over this? And is it even
wouldn't you?
Hermetic?
I mean, this text, I love this text. The Emerald Tablet, I didn't do a whole lot of homework for this episode, not as much as I should have, but the one thing that I did do is I was like, I bet you Justin Sledge has a video about the Emerald Tablet. And sure enough, he did.
Of course
and I
watched it.
And it was delightful. And it was totally like, oh, I love this. Nobody even knows if it's bullshit. The Emerald Tablet is such a gorgeous, beautiful, strange little poem that is inscrutable. I think that one of the reasons that the Emerald Tablet has remained so important is that for a long time in the Western world, most of the Hermetica was lost, but we still had people talking about Hermes Trismegistus and writings that mentioned him as some great sage. People were hungry. You know how you are now, audience. I know you're all out there, and I know there's always this thing where like, how many more occult books can I buy this month before I can't get groceries? Or, oh man, I really want this Brill book. Do you think the gods will be mad if I maybe pirate this? Don't pirate books unless I buy Brill, but
damn.
But like, humanity hasn't changed. Our predecessors, our precursor wizards and alchemists and stuff, were still just as hungry. So when there was this weird, tiny little poem that was supposedly by Hermes Trismegistus, of course they ate it up. They like went over it with a fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out what it said and figure out what it was about. For a long time, a lot of these folks had basically the Emerald Tablet and possibly the Asclepius. But, we know that through the Emerald Tablet, we have this incredible history of like Northern European Hermeticism that birthed all of our favorite weirdo exploding alchemists, before the 17th century. Like all of those guys were strongly influenced by folks writing about or translating or trying to decipher the Emerald Tablet. Is it Hermetic? I think that it's impossible to say that it's not Hermetic. It's sort of like if we don't destroy the Kabbalion now, in 1,000 years, it will be considered Hermetic. Just because everybody has been going apeshit over it, and our voices will get lost in the ether if we don't stop people from reading that book and thinking that they're Hermeticists, because there are polarities and shit.
As Erik mentioned, and Sam has mentioned as well, it is a poem, and you can in certain places, you can go through, I believe it was first written in Arabic, and it is so bare bones, the little segment that we have. It's literally like that which is above is below, and then like 3 other lines, and that's all we have.
Oh man, there's some great ones. There's like, that which is true. Oh, this is true without lying.
Yes. Yeah.
I love that one. So one of the problems that we have with the Emerald Tablet is we don't know if it was necessarily originally Arabic, but I think the earliest versions we have are Arabic.
Right.
Somebody pointed out to me that once, or possibly I pointed it out to myself while I was reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures, but there's a line in the Gospel of Philip in the Nag Hammadi scriptures that is almost identical to one of the lines in the Emerald Tablet. And I was like, oh, but it's probably just coincidence. And Justin Sledge pointed this out. Dr. Sledge pointed this out in his video. Is there were like some really important bits of the Emerald Tablet that kind of like got dropped in one of the Latin translations that ended up being the most popular. Like even Newton's translation from Latin into English, which is probably the one that most people are familiar with, was from a faulty Latin translation from the Arabic. So whichever Emerald Tablet you've read, go back and double check. It probably wasn't the right one.
Is there a story that's underlying the Emerald Tablet?
Yes.
Does it have
Yes.
does it have a mythology to it? What is this mythology of this Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus?
So the thing about the Emerald Tablet is that apparently virtually no one seems to know this. You're like knee deep in academia, but it's from a much larger text called the Book of the Secrets of Creation, attributed to Apollonius Tiana. Like,
wait, it is?
Yes.
This wasn't in Justin's video.
Yes, it's from this giant book called the Book of Secrets of Creation, which is essentially an encyclopedia of its time that talks about all about, quote, natural philosophy. It's basically biology, geology, and all the magic stuff you can do with them. It's a book on talismans. It's a book on early Arabic alchemy. It's a book on potions, all kind of stuff. And there is a vignette in there that talks about how someone went into this tomb of Hermes Trismegistus, and it was completely dark, and he tried taking a lantern into it. And every time he went in, this strange wind would rush forward and then blow the lantern out. And kept happening until basically this angel, or Hermes Trismegistus himself, came down to the person. He's like, hey, if you want to enter my secrets, put a glass chimney over your lantern, dipshit. And then oh, look, I can go inside with the wind blowing it out. Imagine that. And then he found, Hermes seated on this golden throne with this emerald tablet on which was written the Emerald Tablet. Like, it's actually, this is the predecessor to like the story of Perfect Nature in the Picatrix, where Hermes is sitting on top like an edge of a pit, and there's this massive wind, and he can't see the bottom of it, so he tries to lower a candle down, but this wind keeps rising from the pit to blow the candle out. Very similar story. But yeah, like there's this whole book that the Emerald Tablet comes from, and no one's bothered to translate it. Like, it's still in Latin. Like, it was translated once into French, and no one has read it since. Like, my mind is blown at how much people don't actually simply want to do this kind of translation work. I want to learn Arabic just so I can read this kind of stuff. Like, I wish I had the hours in the day. More
Sam, if you stop writing, you'll have time to learn Arabic.
Yeah, that also involves about sleeping. I also need to learn Spanish and like 5 languages as well. But yeah, so the Emerald Tablet, this book first appears in Arabic between 600 to 700 CE. We do not know if it was based on an earlier Greek original. We just don't know. There are arguments for it being a translation from Greek. There are arguments being original Arabic creation. But because of how little it's known, or rather is known about the Emerald Tablet, it has created so much hullabaloo over like the centuries. The people are like, oh, it's clearly ancient Taoist, and here's a hypothetical Chinese original that can be used for them. No, that's not how this shit works. It's mysterious. People don't know about it, therefore it attracts the attention. And while it probably, like, let's be honest, it probably is actually expounded upon and explained in the book of its creation. Haven't read it yet, but there's probably something about it in there. Right. But because people haven't actually looked to its origins, they start to layer on all this other kind of meaning and theories about it. And while it very much does appear to be an alchemical poem that does appear to describe the creation of Philosopher's Stone by means of elemental transmutation, consider how much of that is just later interpolations that we've accepted as the default. We consider the Emerald Tablet to be a poem about alchemy. What if it wasn't, and we've just made it the founding text of an entire alchemical tradition?
Yeah, retroactively. So with that in mind, would you guys say that it's a bit overhyped? I mean,
yes.
As soon as Levy, okay, we'll fight again.
Well, I mean, I guess, listening to Sam explanation, like, I guess there's a part of it that's overhyped. I think the thing that can't be overhyped about it, though, is that it's influential.
100%. It is historically important for the understanding of how Hermeticism was received and how it was developed. On its own, though, it's like, really?
Here's the thing about it. The Hermetica can be tough to get into. They can be obscure, difficult texts. They can be texts that are a little too long for how complex they are sometimes. The Emerald Tablet is like 100 words, maybe 150 words at the most.
You could write it on a napkin.
You could easily write it on a napkin, especially a green one. But it's easy to read. It's going to be confusing, and it's supposed to be. And you can just sort of read it and be like, well, I've read some Hermetica. I don't understand it, which is just, according to that central Hermetic axiom in the Hermetic Tablet, as below, so above. I read the Emerald Tablet and I do not comprehend. I read the rest of the Hermetica and I do not comprehend.
So why read it all at that point?
Well, I mean, you have to read it like 3 times.
Oh, I see. Into a mirror with one candle lit, right?
Oh my God. Only like on a Tuesday night, like at 4 a.m.
Right.
5 during daylight savings.
Absolutely. So, gentlemen, with that cutoff date that we put with Hermeticism and Hermetism, all of the things that you've said, just to keep that in mind, how would you define Hermeticism up to, say, something like the 14th and 15th century? What would you consider classical Hermeticism?
I don't think that it's easy to really put a finger on it, because I'm not sure that it's something that stayed the same.
Okay.
Hermeticism is something that kind of lacks dogma, and because of that, it evolved a lot over that period of time. I think that, there probably at some point there could have been some group that was primarily Hermetic who really did sort of like the campouts in caves, yelling at each other across the caverns to see who was right about their Hermetic doctrines. But, that could have been a thing that only existed for a few generations before stuff changed.
Right.
Maybe then the alchemists moved in, or the astrologers moved in, and they started writing Hermetica or doing Hermetica. And maybe after that, something else happened. I'm not sure. I think that you have to have the cutoff just so that you can say like the true flavor, like the true MSG of Hermetica, the umami of Hermetica came out of a specific period of time where 3 or more cultures came together and smooshed their ideas together. And these cultures were 3 unique world-founding cultures that will never exist again. That particular intersection will never happen again.
Right. Before we get into the second part and another part of the episode, Erik, how do you define Hermetic or Hermeticism? If somebody asks you, because you have it on your passport, that you're a Hermeticist,
I think I have it on my Facebook profile.
Yeah. What do you say makes you a Hermeticist?
All right. Well, okay. I had an experience. Where I guess I would say my noose was moved. I had a, I guess I had a religious revelatory experience while I was reading the Corpus Hermeticum that made the entire experience just sort of like glow in my soul.
Okay.
And I think that's probably the reason I call myself a Hermeticist. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to understand exactly what I experienced, but
It's beautiful. No, I love that, man. That's wonderful. Sam, I got to ask you the same question. Somebody asks, you say you're a Hermeticist or a Hermetist, whatever you prefer at the day. Half of the week you're a Hermeticist, half the week you're a Hermetist. But what do you say? Because everybody's got this idea of what a Hermeticist is. Sam, how do you say that you're a Hermeticist?
So there's a descriptive approach and there's a prescriptive approach.
Okay.
And it's really hard to talk about one without talking about the other. The descriptivist approach of how the word Hermeticism has largely been used in modern times that basically refers to the general body of Western esoterica, which is super vague and super unfortunate, but it is the natural result and progression of 2,000 years of cultural spread across several continents in many different cultures and religious environments of mysticism, of divination, of theology, theosophy, philosophy. It's just, this is what was going to happen all along. When Hermes Trismegistus, and following the very much Greek notion of Hermes being a trickster, appearing in many disguises across many different contexts, appears in so many different contexts, being an astrologer in one context, or an alchemist in one context, or a philosopher in another context, or a king in another context. It's hard to say anything more specific than that. Descriptively. Prescriptively, Hermeticism is and has always been about a mystical path of salvation of the soul that centers on coming to know God, and through that gnosis, come to know oneself, the cosmos, and one's place within the cosmos. That's kind of my high-level definition of what the, quote, way of Hermes is. It's fundamentally about the salvation of the soul by any means necessary, knowing what we're capable of, which requires knowing who and what we are, where we come from, where we're going, why we're here. All of that is revealed to us through gnosis, and having that gnosis is what we strive for as Hermeticists. Or Hermetists, either or, same thing in this case.
Holy shit, Sam, that was beautiful.
It was beautiful.
I'm so sorry. What boring lives you leave.
And so that concludes Hermeticism with Erik and Sam Part I. Lots to think about, lots to look into. So to be able to find some resources on Hermeticism, specifically geared towards this episode, please head to whatmagicisthis.com. There you will find show notes on pretty much almost everything that we talked about in this show. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend, and perhaps they'll enjoy the show as well. And that's kind of how this thing works. I don't do a lot of promotion for my show, so if you tell a friend, perhaps they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend, and that's how this snowball gets rolling. It would be greatly appreciated. Also, if you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or any place that you can leave a review. The whole star clicky thing is totally fine. I get it. We've all got things to do. But if you want to write a few words about how much you enjoy the show, that would be greatly appreciated. People do read those reviews. It is one of the things that allows for podcasts to be looked into a little bit more, and perhaps I'll get a couple of new listeners due to the wonderful review you've written about my show. If you enjoy the show and you want to support in some kind of a way, as well as get exclusive content, like full episodes involving the Goetia or deities of a certain kind or gods, or even videos of me making things and taking you through a process, I have a Patreon account. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I don't have a ton of tiers. I literally only have one. It is $7 a month. That is all I am asking, and you get access to plenty of things, including a Discord server, which is growing by leaps and bounds each and every week, and the discussions that we have there are quite fantastic. At this point, this podcast is my job. This is what I do full time, 8 to 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. This is my thing, and I really love it, and I really enjoy it, and I would love for it to become an even bigger part of my life than it already is. Best way of doing that is supporting me on Patreon. Again, $7 a month. That's all that I'm asking for. If you don't feel like doing the subscribing for every month, I do have a PayPal Me account. It is on whatmagicisthis.com. Just basically click any of the PayPal buttons there. You can send me $5, you can send me $10, you can send me $20 to $5,000. It all goes back into helping the podcast and running this thing. Thing is that you don't get access to any of the exclusive content that is only available on the Patreon account, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Hermeticism with Erik and Sam. There will be a part 2 following in less than a week from when this episode was released. Please tune in. It deals with some of the more modern aspects of Hermeticism and a bit more of the history of Hermeticism over the last 600 years. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. So until then, I want you to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.